Hello and welcome to a very brief introduction to the main principles of Marxist theory. The aim is to help you to then go on to apply this to specific topic areas. If he were alive today, he'd probably be really surprised at how his work took off. He probably wouldn't say this: if you study you will get good marks. With reference to the establishment of modern sociology, three names rank above all others: Durkheim, Weber and Karl Marx, pictured here. Marx's ideas form the basis of Marxist theory. You don't need to know that he was born in Germany in 1818, moved to London in 1849, where he died in 1883 and was buried at Highgate Cemetery in London, but it is useful to consider the historical context of his work. Although Marx was born nearly 2 decades after the opening of the 19th century and died well before the end of it, his writings have had their greatest influence, certainly in the political sphere, and possibly even in the intellectual world, in the 20th century and beyond. Having looked at functionalism as our first major sociological theory, it is worth considering the two separate elements of this question. Firstly, how is Marxism similar? And then secondly, how is it different? Remember, it is important to be able to compare and contrast theories to each other. To start with similarities, both functionalism and Marxism are both what we call structural theories, meaning that they both see the individual as a product of his or her society. They're historically from the same era. This is something that will make much more sense later on in the course, when we look at the concepts of modernity and postmodernity in relation to sociological theory. A third similarity to note here at this stage is that they are both what we call macro theories. That means they consider society as a whole. The main difference is that whilst functionalists are what is known as a consensus theory, looking for the general agreement and how this benefits all of society, Marxism is what is known as a conflict theory. We will go on to explore what this means. A useful starting point is to go all the way back to our first sociology lesson in September. You were asked to create a new society from scratch on a desert island. Your answer to the first question is a useful way of thinking about the meaning behind this term, relations of production. In other words, the relations of production refers to the relationships people enter into to produce food, objects and services. To revisit your desert island and the construction of a society, what you need to make things and how you answer this reveals the answer to the question, what is meant by the term means of production. You could use an example of anything. What do you need to make a hot dog, a lilo, or a radio? Those things, that is, what you need to produce a good or service, is known as the means of production. Moving away from the desert island completely, these are some examples of those things that are used to produce goods and services, namely raw materials, tools, machinery, factories, office buildings and land. In response to this question, who owned the means of production, most people answer by saying that things were shared amongst the new inhabitants of the island. Your answers are likely, in most cases, to be very similar to how Karl Marx viewed things at the dawn of human history. He believed that people lived in a state of primitive communism. Food and shelter were communally owned by all members of society. Each member produced for themselves and for society as a whole. There were no conflicts of interests. Everybody worked for everybody else. Things changed with the emergence of private property, in particular with the private ownership of the means of production, that is, the things used to produce and make things. Marx's theory looks at how the economy is the factor that determines pretty much everything. Therefore, we'll look at what that means as part of this introduction. We might consider some of the following. These are just some of the terms that we might associate with the economy. It means we're looking at what, where, how, and who produces and consumes, and how these different parts relate to each other. As someone who can read, this may surprise you, Marxism does in fact begin and end not with the letter M, but rather E. It begins and ends with the economy. Marx pointed out that the formation of an exchange economy is the outcome of a historical process, and capitalism is a historically specific system of production. It's only one type of productive system amongst others which have preceded it in history, and is no more the final form than the others which went before it. Hence, Marxism begins and ends with the economy. I made reference to a specific type of economy, a capitalist economy, and we need to focus on what that means. For much more detail, you could watch a video such as this on YouTube. If you type in History of Ideas Capitalism, then you'll be able to access much more detail on this subject. But in simpler terms, it's the economy we have in the UK today. Carefully consider these well-known companies or brands. Why do they exist? I mean, really, why do they exist? What is their purpose? Obviously, Chicken Nando's exists to bring us tasty food, but its real purpose as a company is to make a profit. In a capitalist economy, we can associate it with the formation of an industrial society, and crucially, the profits go to private individuals or shareholders, rather than states, governments, or shared or divvied up equally, as it might have been on your desert island. For the last point, consider why the Apple iPhone becomes more successful than the Nokia. The answer is because we live in a free market economy that's said to be based on the forces of supply and demand. For a simplified version of capitalism, think about a typical lunchtime at a McDonald's restaurant. People are buying food, people are making food, people are eating food. The profit is calculated by the sales, or revenue, minus the costs. This becomes what Marxist theory describes as the surplus value, and is a key feature of a capitalist society, and is central to Marx's analysis. This surplus value is vital to consider when we look at Marx's classification of social class. For Marx, we only have two: the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, who don't. For Marx, what is the relationship between these two classes? Then we can consider the popular television programme, The Simpsons. Mr. Burns becomes the bourgeoisie, and Homer represents the proletariat. Think about how these characters relate to each other. For Marx, the relationship is one that is based on exploitation. The bourgeoisie exploit the proletariat, quite simply because they own the means of production. This leads to inequality. Some people are very rich, but most people aren't. The structure of a capitalist society means that there is a big gap between rich and poor. Both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat both want more money. B wants higher profits, B wants higher wages. This means they have different interests, and this is where the conflict occurs. This illustrates just how much profit per employee these companies have made. If those profits were shared equally, in a capitalist society, they're not. So why don't we see more strikes? If there's so much exploitation, why don't more people strike back? The reason is, from a Marxist perspective, and this is a key difference between Marxism and functionalism, is the role of the social institutions. Some examples are given here, but as we did with functionalism, we'll start by looking at the role and functions of the family, this time from the Marxist perspective.